Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for bearing with the weather and getting here and the heat and the rain and the ever-changing climate. I'm Lissa Muscatine. I'm one of the co-owners of Politics and Prose, along with my husband, Brad Graham, who's right there in the green shirt. And on behalf of our fabulous staff, we welcome you all to tonight's event. And we are in for a great conversation. I've been really waiting for this one for a long time, and I'm so excited to be able to be here to host Joe Conason. His new book is called The Longest Con: How Grifters, Swindlers, and Frauds Hijacked American Conservatism. Most of you probably know that Joe has had a long and distinguished career as a journalist and commentator, beginning as a reporter for local and alternative newspapers, including the Village Voice, where he broke stories about Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos's real estate dealings in New York. And since those early days, Joe's written pieces for The Nation, The New Republic, Harper's, Spy, The Guardian, I'm sure I'm forgetting some, and he spent 20 years at The Observer, including as executive editor. Today he's editor-in-chief of the National Memo and a senior fellow at Type Media Center. It's kind of a theme there if you put them all together. And that list amounts really to several careers worth of work in and of itself. But on top of that, Joe has also written 6 books, including 2 previous bestsellers, The Hunting of the President and Big Lies. His reporting and writing have covered a range of topics: the rise of authoritarianism, the use of right-wing propaganda in politics, the Bush administration's plans to end Social Security, Bill Clinton's global work in his post-presidency, and more. Now, I just want to say, kind of on a personal note, that I became an admirer of Joe pretty early on when he and Gene Lyons published The Hunting of the President about a quarter century ago. And it was the first book to contextualize the serial scandals that dogged Bill and Hillary Clinton in Arkansas and in the White House. And in it, the authors explored, among other things, the lies, grudges, and personal attacks that were hallmarks of the hunting of the nation's 42nd president, Bill Clinton. It was such an illuminating and important book, and as someone who worked in the Clinton White House, I just have to say, Joe, thank you. It was really the first book that looked really at the origins of these scandals, what motivated them, and we can see some of the ramifications of that today, of course. The con might be called the macro story. It fills in more blanks about how and why American conservatism has, over decades, turned into the grievance-ridden, fear-mongering, grift-fueled movement it is today, led by liars and hucksters who demagogue the public to enrich themselves. Of course, liars and hucksters make for great storytelling, and Joe is a master of that genre. Many of the tales he recounts are eye-popping and indeed horrifying, but there is a silver lining. As awful as the stories and the protagonists are, there are actually many laugh-out-loud moments in this book. And I was thinking about it because at some point in the book, Joe, he's telling a story about Roy Cohn and one of the many ludicrous, horrible things involving Roy Cohn. He talks about one, and he says the nation didn't know whether to laugh or weep. And I sort of feel like that's what happens throughout this book. It's sort of the book is kind of a tragic comedy itself. So, and you'll recognize many names in the book, but one name that may surprise you is that of longtime Republican lawyer George T. Conway III, who wrote the foreword. And if you look to your left, you may see him right there, because George very kindly and generously is here to be in conversation with Joe. I think you all know George has in recent years become one of the most respected and vocal guardians of true conservatism. And if you read his foreword, I think I interpret it as him being as horrified as Joe Conason by the grift and greed that have, as Joe says in his title, hijacked the conservative movement. I'm not sure that 20 years ago, Joe would have ever imagined George Conway writing a foreword to his book. And I'm not really sure that George Conway would have imagined being asked to write one or being coerced to write one, or however it happened. And I think I want to echo something that Joe says at the end of the book, which is that it's really encouraging and hopeful. And I totally felt this way, too, when I saw that George was written the foreword. That these two amazing guys have joined forces in this moment of crisis in our country. So Oh, and I have to say one other thing about George. You all know that he's on TV a lot. He's been this incredibly important voice in this last few years. Just make sure you're aware that he has started a new PAC. It's called the Anti-Psychopath Political Action Committee. It's evidence-based and research-based, I think it's fair to say, right, George? I mean, it's not just rhetoric.
We've been watching the evidence for years.
I've been watching the evidence. It's a mountain of evidence, and I'm sure he would appreciate your support. So I'll put that good word in for him and his Anti-Psychopath Political Action Committee. It's a pleasure to have them both here. Such an honor for us, such a treat. And I hope you all enjoy the evening. I know you will. Please join me in welcoming Joe Conason and George Conway.
It's on. It's on.
It's on? Okay. Well, first of all, Lisa, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's always a pleasure to be here in this great bookstore, where I've received many a gift over the years from my in-laws who live in Washington. My wife grew up here, so Politics and Prose is like a temple for us, and it's an honor to be here with you tonight. Thank you all for coming. The other thing I wanted to say is it is equally an honor to be here with my friend, George Conway. And Alyssa...
I still have a beef to pick about that other book that you read.
Yes. George.
Can we come back for a second? Okay.
So, yeah, well, so there is a backstory. It's not exactly... Yeah. Alyssa alluded to the fact that some years back, George and I were not the best of friends, to say the least. I wrote about him in the New York Observer back when he was a lawyer involved in the Paula Jones case, and you know, I wasn't his favorite person. Let's put it that way. Flash forward.
Your favorite person?
Oh, right. That's fair enough. Fair enough. Yes. No, I was chasing him down, and he didn't like it. And it was not great. Not a great way to get acquainted. But flash forward, and I finished this book, and the book is about conservatives and both the honest kind and the dishonest kind. And I tried very hard in writing this book not to rely on liberals as the sources, as the people commenting in it. I wanted it to be largely conservatives commenting on the degeneration of conservatism and how distressing that was to them. So when the book was finished, I said, I need an honest conservative to write the foreword. I need a foreword to the book. And my wife said to me, well, who was already by then a big fan of Conway, says to me on Twitter, she says, oh, you should get George Conway. And I said, you don't remember, but he doesn't like me. I mean, although by then we were following each other on Twitter, but even so, I was like, Anyway, long story short, I called him up, I got in touch with him and I said, you know, I need to talk to you about something else. We were doing a panel together on some anti-Trump conference, and I said, you know, you need to come in and we should meet. He came in, and as he said, I plied him with some alcohol, and the next thing you know, he volunteers to write the foreword himself. You know, I said to him, so George, I need your advice. I need somebody to write the foreword to this book. And he said, looks me right in the eye, said, do you want me to do it? And I said, well, so anyway, he did a wonderful job, and we have become friends, and which has been one of the bright lights in a often very grim political environment.
Donald Trump has brought people together.
Yes. Donald Trump, that's quite right. So yes, I have to give him credit for that much. And he inspired this book in a lot of ways. The reason that the book starts with Roy Cohn, and we'll maybe get to that, is that I knew it was going to end with Trump. So, or almost end with Trump. I talk about some other people at the end too, but so it would naturally begin with Roy, who was Trump's mentor, who I knew a little bit when I was covering politics in New York, Village Voice years ago. But as I looked into him, I realized, and you'll see this if you read the first chapter of The Longest Con, is that he was lionized by the right, despite his incredibly immoral and kind of despicable career. He was nevertheless held up as a guy to be admired, somebody that they loved. William F. Buckley, William Safire of the New York Times, Ronald Reagan, welcomed him to the White House. This was somebody who shouldn't have been welcomed anywhere. He was eventually disbarred for stealing from his clients. He's a very bad guy. But he was also the mentor of Donald Trump. And when Trump famously in the White House was frustrated with his own attorneys who were not quite as willing to go down the path of darkness as Roy, would say, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" So that's why the book began with Roy Cohn.
And then he found Alina Habba.
Yes, and then he found Alina Habba, who was probably not as good a lawyer as Roy, but anyway, so George and I are going to talk about the book. He has read the book. He was one of the first people to read it and liked it enough to write the wonderful foreword that he did. And he's been incredible help to me in this process. So,
All right. Well, let's talk about the book.
yes.
Why now? Why did you choose to write it down? What prompted, what gave you the idea, and why did you think this was a particularly good time to write it, or
Well,
what struck you?
now was actually a few years ago when I started this book, and my wife and children will tell you it was many years ago, but anyway, it was a while ago. It took a while to do, but it was clear to me during the era of Trump that the decay of conservatism as a moral political force, as a source of civic virtue, any of the things that it had once aspired to be as a political philosophy, let alone forget about in practice necessarily, but the ideas had decayed. They had fallen away under Trump, and the question was why that had happened. And then, while I'm sitting there thinking about that, again, my wife says to me, she had just read an article in a magazine called The Baffler by a historian named Rick Perlstein, whose books I commend to you, a brilliant guy. And he had written an article in The Baffler about the Mitt Romney 2012 campaign. This is not the Romney we kind of like now. This was the other Romney who was running against Barack Obama and ran a very mendacious and nasty campaign. And Rick wrote a great piece about it, but in the course of in writing that piece, he sort of digressed about the fact that he had subscribed to a bunch of right-wing publications and websites. And suddenly, his mailbox was just crammed with scam offers, scam emails. Buy this gold at an inflated price. Buy these nutritional supplements that won't do anything. Buy these, we'll cure cancer for you. We'll cure your arthritis, and we'll make you rich at the same time. I mean, one thing after another, and to the point where he realized that this grifting industry on the right had become integral to conservatism in the modern era. And why was that? How did that happen? And he, examined some of that in the article. And I read that and I said, there's much more to this than he could do in a magazine piece. And this is a book, and it's a book. It's not only is it a book, but it's a book that explains a lot about how we reached the apotheosis of Trump, the con man. So that's really how it came about.
So tell us about Roy Cohn. Why did you start with Roy Cohn? Did it really start with Roy Cohn, or was it just, did you decide to start with him because of his connections with Trump, or
Yeah,
what,
no,
what,
well,
what happened there?
Roy Cohn was,
Tell us the story.
yes, Roy Cohn was a conceit, as I said, that, because we're going to end with Trump, that we should start with Roy. But, again, as I looked at it more closely and did the reporting and the research, I realized that there were good reasons to start there. One was that anti-communism as a political phenomenon in America became a grift in itself. Roy was a notorious crook in the end, and it was clear to me when I started researching him, that in the anecdote that I begin the book with, he had used the anti-communist crusade as a means to advance his own interests. Specifically, he went on a trip to Europe with a young man named David Shine, who he may or may not have had some kind of relationship with, but anyway, he got McCarthy to hire this guy, who was completely unqualified to work on a Senate committee, and they went off on a trip to Europe, all the major capitals, finest hotels, under the pretense of rooting out subversive literature in the U.S. Information Service libraries, of which there was none, and they managed to get a couple of books actually burned. I mean, they embarrassed the United States terribly at a time when we actually were contesting with communist forces in Europe. So it was a complete debacle, and it was Roy who eventually brought McCarthy down, his misbehavior around David Shine with the Army, trying to get special privileges for Shine and threatening the Army. Not very patriotic, I would add, for him to have been doing that, but in any case, that grift, that con, struck me as something that was a great way to start the book, and it was both amusing, as Alyssa said, and tragic, because people lost their livelihoods over this nonsense, and it was kind of awful. He later returned to New York and perpetrated much more serious grifts and cons and scams than that, including, having people sign codicil on their deathbed to turn their property over to his clients, and stealing money from the parking bureau. I mean, just crazy stuff that he got into. But he had a symbolic valence to me that was important.
What's the through line between him and
the modern grifters? Well, as I said, so it moves from Roy and his anti-communist grift to a broader anti-communist grift, which is a bunch of preachers who ran things like the Christian Anti-Communism Crusade and the Christian Crusade, and they had various different names, and what they would do was go around the country getting people to come to lecture halls and pay hundreds of dollars to buy tapes, to listen to the lectures. And the lectures were all about exaggerating the paranoia around communism to a boiling point that was almost unimaginable. I mean, they basically were saying communism is going to take over by the end of the year, or the end of next year, or within a few years. And it's going to either execute you and your families, or it will abolish Thanksgiving at the minimum. They had all kinds of insane predictions that they got people to believe. When you look at QAnon today and what they've made people believe, this is a long tradition in America of getting people to believe stuff that's nonsense. And these so-called professional anti-communists, Billy James Hargis, Dr. Fred Schwartz, I mean, this is some of what Alyssa read that probably made her laugh, the stuff that these people were doing. And yet, it was so obnoxious that even J. Edgar Hoover found it offensive. I mean, he was like, if you can imagine that.
He knew what a real communist was.
Yes, he was, well, he was the real expert, as he would have told you on communism. But, so in researching the book, I came across these FBI files that had been released of communications between Hoover and his subordinates about these people. And they investigated them. They were so irritated by them that they actually opened files on them, and they had them investigated various places and debunked a lot of their claims about themselves and their knowledge. But he never really exposed them, but they were really, really mad. And they set all this down in memos that I quoted in the book.
They're annoyed because it makes people think that they weren't doing their job, right?
Right, yes. So, yes, that's right, exactly right. When Hoover would, hear these guys say, the federal government is completely controlled by communists, up to and including, President Eisenhower and President Kennedy. It was like, well, was Hoover, a potted plant? What was he doing? So that made him very mad, and he thought that was actually tantamount to subversion itself. So he really went after them, and that's an amusing part of the book. But it was also an example of how the grift began to work. That if you could find the right sort of people out in the countryside, or the suburbs or whoever, who were willing to part with at that time, hundreds of dollars. I mean, these guys were raking in what would be millions of dollars now. Then you had a good business.
Yeah. And this was like through postage stamps, mailing people mailing checks in, or was it how did they do this?
They collected at the site.
door.
You know, they do it at the door. Some of them would mail it in. I mean, there were different examples in the book of how these games work.
So we weren't at mail order yet. We're going to get to mail order.
Well, so yes, yes, he's next.
Yeah,
Although he was in with these
Yeah.
people, a band
So
name.
I mean, there's almost a taxonomy to it. You've got the preachers,
Yes,
and then you've got just general scaremongers.
correct.
What else do we have? How would you, if you had to categorize them all, how would you categorize all
Well,
these?
so there are, as you suggest, there are different. There's a religious strand in it that goes all the way back, a pseudo-religious strand, I would say, and that comes up to the present day. The ministers or preachers surrounding Trump, who are involved in something called the prosperity gospel that I have a chapter on in the book, which is unbelievable.
Or won't you buy me
Bunch
a
of-
Mercedes-Benz?
Correct, exactly right. Or won't you parishioners buy me a Mercedes-Benz?
Right.
Or a couple of Mercedes-Benzes and a jet and a bunch of other things.
And some Trump sneakers.
Yes, I mean, it's just, they recognize a kindred spirit in Trump. But anyway, there's that category, that brand. There were we come to the sort of, the people who are running grifts around gold, or, and the idea that you create paranoia around any number of issues or problems that you can get people to worry about. So you get them to worry that the economy is going to crash and burn and it will never come back, and you better stockpile some gold. And I have some gold for you, albeit at a very inflated price, gold coins, which you actually can't do anything with, but, and I'll sell them to you. And
This is before Trump NFTs, right?
Yes.
Yes.
But Sean Hannity, for instance, a big marketer of gold, gold stocks and gold objects that are not worth what you pay for them. So there's that kind of grift, the sort of marketing grift that Trump participated in heavily. And, then there's the political grifters, the people like the ones who founded the Tea Party movement and the Tea Party organizations that all ended up feuding with each other, which is also a hilarious story that I tell in the book, how they were doing unbelievable stuff to each other to make the other Tea Party group look bad, because they were competing for the same category of rubes, to contribute to them. So, those are some of the categories, anyway.
And so, one of the other stories here is how all of this developed and grew with technology. And it began with computerized mailing lists.
That's right. So the beginning.
But this is the time when they probably punched the names in of people on punch cards on IBM.
Well, it started out with them writing them longhand, actually.
Right.
When a man named Richard Viguerie, who used to be a very big name in this town, he's still around, sort of. But he was at one time the most powerful direct mail entrepreneur in America, if not the world. And the way he started, which I talk about in the book, is he had been a conservative publicist and fundraiser, very frustrated by the fact that there was no, you couldn't get a list of the conservatives. They just weren't, they had never formed a mass.
And what year was this?
So, well, he was doing this in the late 50s, early 60s, and then flash of insight after the Goldwater campaign, which was a total failure electorally. They only carried the Confederacy, basically, but was a big success from the point of view of the far right, because they had gotten a significant number of votes that they had never gotten before, and they had collected millions of names of people who supported that kind of politics. And Viguerie realized that those names were on lists in the Capitol, in the custody of the Clerk of the House, which is how you
Why the clerk of the House?
Because in those, before the Federal Election Commission was formed in the 70s, that's how you filed the names of any donor over $50 would have to have their name recorded and put in.
And addresses?
Yeah, and so Viggory sent a bunch of course, women secretaries up to the Capitol to write down all the names. And before the clerk of the House realized that letting them do this might not be a great idea, they had gotten almost all of them and brought them back to Richard Viggory, who put them on magnetic tape, which was the technology of the time, and started mailing out solicitations to them. And it was enormously successful. They had millions of names. And it gave him incredible power, but it also, by then, he had learned a lot by studying Madison Avenue techniques and other sort of geniuses of the time who knew how to market to unsuspecting people. They began to raise huge amounts of money for right-wing causes, and keeping most of it. I mean, really keeping almost all of it. So they would tell you, we're going to, elect so-and-so, or we're going to, stamp out homosexuality or labor unions or any of the things that bothered them. And very little of the money would go to that. One of the people who he was involved with early on was a man named Charles Keating, who had an anti-pornography organization. And Viggory raised a lot of money for that, and they kept most of that money too. As you can imagine, Charles Keating later went to prison, as you may know, for his role in the savings and loan scandal. But he was a grifter even way before that, doing right-wing stuff.
So these mailing lists became pretty valuable. There are some good stories about people fighting over them, right?
They are incredibly valuable, and they became, well, I mean, even now, Trump has big mailing lists, and the people in and around Trump have wanted to use them for various things, and he jealously guards all that stuff. You will get excommunicated if you try to make money off of Trump's mailing lists. It's just not done. So, but this is what the Tea Party internecine warfare was all about, was their lists and the names of people and who was using them, who would reach them, who would be able to harvest them, basically. For no purpose at all in the end, except that the Tea Party provided a fertile ground for Trump.
Why is that?
Well, because it emphasized themes that were his themes, that were consonant with his kind of politics: nativism, racism, to a great degree, anger, just sort of diffuse and generalized anger. The anti-psychopath political action committee may want to address someday. It's the undifferentiated anger that lots of people in America feel. But it was perfect for him, and especially because in the beginning, the Tea Party avatar was Sarah Palin. It had grown out of as an anti-Obama movement. And Sarah Palin had run against Obama and Biden, and they all thought she was going to run for president. But all she was really going to do was grift. You can tell that story in the book too. So she grifted for a couple of years, pretending to run for president, and then got out of the way. And there was Trump, who had run to the head of the birther conspiracy movement and elevated himself that way. The birther movement was a Tea Party phenomenon. So he was there to grab a hold of that.
And how about all the infighting among Tea Party groups? What was that all about? Were they fighting on principle?
Oh no, they were. I'm not sure what they thought the principles were for the Tea Party. I mean,
percentage maybe.
Yes, these were people who, and some of them are well known now. Jenny Beth Martin was one, and several others who became figures in local Tea Party organizations that they then quickly took national, because that was the way to make a lot of money from them. And they ran behind Trump very quickly. They realized that Trump was the way to go, and some of them were even involved in the January 6th stuff. I mean, they were deep in the Trump movement.
Well, January 6th really was also a culmination of that. I mean, he raised $250 million
Right.
on a lie.
Correct.
It really was, I mean,
Yes. So this is why I feel so strongly that the grift and the ideology, the grift and the politics are so thoroughly entwined. They're inseparable, especially with Trump. Because in the aftermath of the 2020 election, they determined early on, Jared Kushner gave an order to the what was called T-Magic, which was the Trump fundraising committee, that they were going to stay in business after the election. They were going to continue after the election and keep raising money. And on the promise that they would have what they called an election defense fund. Maybe that's not the exact name, but the idea was we're going to
integrity.
Yes, we're going to use this money to contest the election, and that wasn't what they used the money for at all. In fact, that fund actually never existed, even though the RNC and the Trump committee mailed out, millions and.
Oh,
millions
Rudy's still
of
waiting for his check.
Yes, he right. So, yeah, that's right. They didn't pay those people, but they collected $250 million, and that Trump still has control of. They've spent a fair amount of it on his legal fees, not on contesting the election, but on his criminal cases and his legal defense. But that's one of the biggest grifts and cons of all time.
What was the thing that you learned in researching and writing this book that most surprised you? Like, you just had no idea. Anything? Or did you expect everything that you came across?
Well, I mean, I've been studying these people for quite a while now, George, so it's like they don't often surprise me. But what I will say was of great interest to me, and it's something that I talk about a lot at the end of the book, is that within the right now, and I hesitate to use the word conservative to describe any of these people, they're not conservative. You're conservative, fairly, still. But
yeah, I'm trying to conserve things. I don't
you
want
are. It's right.
blow everything up.
Like the
even
Constitution,
I don't
for
want
instance.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
I mean, it's not perfect, but I don't
But
want to
what struck me about the culture of the right now is that it's a culture of impunity. It's a culture in which there is no sanction for the kind of behavior that I'm describing, and it's why
the kind of behavior, what, lying? And
lying, cheating, stealing, ripping people off.
It's a way of advancement.
It is a way of advancement, and the reason, this is why it is metastasized, because there was never a sanction against it. Dating back to Roy Cohn, no sanction. It was all tolerated and even encouraged, to the point where you now have someone like Steve Bannon, who is going to go on trial. He's in, he's now out of jail. He's going to end up back in jail, and the reason is that he stole from conservatives a lot of money, millions of dollars. 3 guys that he did this with went to prison already. They've done their time. Now, one might still be inside, but 2 of them have already done their time, got out. He didn't go in because Trump pardoned him. Why did he pardon him? Well, Roger Stone says he blackmailed Trump, whatever it was. But the answer is, not only Trump pardoned him, all of conservatism pardoned him. He is a leader. He's a leader. He's a revered leader. They're all upset that he's going to go to jail again. Why? Why are they upset about that? Because they don't care that he stole millions of dollars from their own people on false pretenses, from people who wanted to build the wall. That's what the ripoff was. We're going to build the wall. And I tell the whole story of that in the book, and it's a really fascinating story. I mean, there's quite a bit of detail that, unfortunately, the mainstream press rarely mentions, if ever. But there's a lot to say about that. And in the culture of impunity, it spawns more. So you now have somebody like Charlie Kirk. I don't know if you all know who Charlie Kirk is. He's the aging leader of the Trump youth movement. He's 30 now, and he's the one who tells kids not to go to college. And if you were Charlie Kirk, you wouldn't need to go to college because you figured out how to grift off of mostly elderly conservatives who send money into his organization, Turning Point USA, and he's made millions of dollars. He owns 3 homes at the age of 30. He, had a $1 million wedding. I mean, it's just, it goes on and on. The National Rifle Association, the same thing. very few conservatives spoke, or right-wingers spoke out against the National Rifle Association, even though it was clear they were running an enormous grift and con game and stealing millions of dollars from conservatives. So this is what has struck me in writing the book, is that they love to talk about owning the libs. You know, that's the thing. We'll own the libs. You know, they put up some meme or something, and we've really owned the libs. But they're chumps because
they're owning themselves.
They get owned themselves. That's who is getting owned.
But I mean, it just seems to me though that, as you say, there's no punishment. There's no
there's punishment by
sanction.
Democratic office holders occasionally.
Occasionally,
you know,
but
you
there's
can get
only-
prosecuted.
There's really just reward.
Yes.
And the costs of entry aren't really that great if you get a hold of a mailing list somehow. And so it's like what that writer said, you're just bombarded with all sorts of texts and emails and all sorts of things asking for money, and it still works for them. How? Isn't it the same people give over and over again, or what is it?
It is the same people who give over and over again, and they managed to expand. I mean, Trump's made it much bigger. I think, you know, if you get on the Trump mailing list, which I have the feeling you are, then you know how
nice notes occasionally.
you know how it goes. It's
relentless.
Yes, it's utterly relentless, and you know, there are supposed rewards. They'll tell you if you buy this, then you might get to have dinner with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. I mean, it's all crazy. Yeah, oh wow, that's right. I've been to Mar-a-Lago. You could skip it.
You've been to Mar-a-Lago. I never have.
I've been there twice.
Something going on with that.
I have a friend who's a member at Mar-a-Lago, and he's taken me to dinner there. And one time Trump was there and was not that happy to see me there. But
we should go together.
I would love that. We could. He saw me at the table, and he sort of did a double take and walked away. And then
he probably remembers you from the old days.
Yes, he does. Then he came back. It was like seeing a ghost, I think. But he came back and shook hands and said hello, and composed himself. And then the third time he came back with Melania, just like, here's my
sort of overpaid occurrences.
Here's my trophy wife. Yeah. So it was really funny. But I digress. Should we?
What's the? Well, we're gonna go to questions in a minute, but I want to ask one last question.
Yes.
What's the funniest story in the book? What's the funniest story in the book?
Oh, the funniest story?
The best cocktail party story in the book.
Well, one of my favorites, I don't know if it's the best one, is the Tea Party honchos, the honchos of two rival Tea Party groups putting out sexual rumors about each other that were the most tawdry, I mean, awful stuff about, you know, one of them was supposedly pimping her daughter, and the other one was cheating on her. You know, it was just the most
lovely people.
Yeah, really, and they eventually ended up in litigation over this, and had to admit it was all lies. And in the course of, you know, the depositions, the guy who had done most of this admitted that the reason he had done it was because they were competing for, you know, the subscribers, the donors. That this was, so I thought that was about as good as it gets. So.
Okay, questions. How does it work? You walk up to the phone.
Hi. First off, I've only read one of your other books. It Can't Happen Here, but big fan of it.
Thank you. That one always gets overlooked, but that's actually a book about the roots of authoritarianism in the present day, dating back to the Bush administration, with many ironies, such as the fact that the villain of that book is Dick Cheney, and our heroine now is his daughter. So things can change in funny ways. But please go ahead.
Well, I wanted to know, I apologize, I haven't read the book yet. I just picked it up tonight. I wanted to know if you covered...
Get cracking.
If you cover the nexus between the wellness industry and politics, because I was very shocked to find out that a lot of the medications that the previous administration was pushing, they were pushing because one of them, for example, came off patent, and one of his close friends owned part of a company that
Right.
was making it?
So there's a little of that in the book. For instance, Mike Huckabee, who you may recall as a Fox News personality, former governor of Arkansas and general nuisance. He was hawking cures, health stuff, and they have various forms of that. But I will say, the honest response to that is, there's not enough of that in the book. There should be a lot more, and I hope somebody will write that book. That is a really important book. Yeah.
Thank you so much for writing this book. I look forward to reading it. I'm sure my dad would buy the book. Okay. And you have told stories about how Trump, why he became, someone as flawed as Trump, has become president, has basically taken over the Republican Party, and until this Sunday will probably return to the White House. And as you said, a lot of conservatives believe in him. But what about the rest of Americans? Why have other people not seen through this con?
So, thank you for that question. That is an important part of this book, because when I say that Trump is the king of the con men, how did he become that? It began with his book called The Art of the Deal, which was published back in the 80s and was a huge bestseller. It's one of the best-selling business books of all time. And it recounts the tale of a young man, young real estate mogul.
True story, right?
Well, not really. And in fact, it's fictional. The author of that book, Tony Schwartz, who George and I met not that long ago, now says that it was entirely made up. There was no such so in the book, I called the person who's the hero of that book, I call him, quote, Trump, unquote, because that's a fictional character, the genius billionaire. Now, but that book alone could not do it. That book contributed a lot to the myth of Trump that spread and made him into an important figure in American culture, but what really did it was his TV show, The Apprentice, which ran for 14 seasons, incredibly successful, one of the most successful TV shows ever. And that, too, guess what? Entirely fictional. It was a reality TV show. It was supposedly showing you Trump as he really functioned. But in fact, it was filmed on a set in Trump Tower that they had to build because the insides of Trump Tower were in such bad shape they could not film it in the regular offices because everything was chipped and kind of falling apart. The scripts were designed to make him look smart, and they had to work really hard at that because the decisions he made were mostly dumb. And the producers of the show have recounted all of this in various places, but especially in a brilliant New Yorker profile of a few years ago that I quote in the book. But there's more to it. And if you look at Trump over and over again, he has been portrayed as something that he's not, but in a way that was presented to millions of Americans. So if you didn't watch The Apprentice, you would not understand how Trump was going to become what he became. And I will confess, I never watched it. I thought it was a stupid idea, and I knew about him already. I knew him from covering him in New York. New Yorkers knew about him, and there's a reason why when he ran for president the first time in the Republican primary in New York, his own congressional district voted against him. They voted for what's the guy's name, Kasich, who they'd never heard of, but he was not Trump, so they voted for him. So New Yorkers knew, but most Americans had no idea. And they believed in this mythical Trump who was, all-powerful and wise.
And one of the biggest, I remember about The Apprentice, there was actually a Ponzi scheme that was promoted during The Apprentice called ACN.
Oh, yes. So that was a multi-level marketing scam.
Okay.
So
Ponzi
yes,
scheme.
so I'm glad you mentioned that,
Yeah.
because in the wake of The Apprentice came many scams that Trump then initiated on his, gullible fans. And one of them was ACN, which was a multi-level marketing scheme, marketing a video phone, and these phones could actually only call other phones of the same kind, but they got people to buy in to sell them. and you would have to put up money to do that. And Trump collected millions of dollars just from sponsoring this thing, while other people lost a lot of money. And that happened again. He did it again with a nutritional supplements scam. That was also a multi-level marketing scheme. He did it with Trump University, which people have heard of more. That was a fake real estate seminar where he was supposed to tell you the secrets of becoming as smart as he actually is not about selling real estate, and had to eventually cough up $25 million because there was a sanction for that. Why? Because 2 attorneys general went after him in New York and California. So he did one of these cons after another, and there's quite a bit about that in the book.
Thank you for writing the book, and thank you, George Conway, for all you've done. The rest of us just give money and make phone calls, but you've both done really important work. I have 2 questions, and they may be answered in the book. I haven't read the book yet. One is, why is this through line of grift that you described, starting with Roy Cohn and continuing through today, why has that arisen on the right rather than the left? What is there about the right that provides fertile ground? And
You wrote the book. You did the research.
the other question is, how do you think the mainstream media has done? How would you grade their performance in covering Trump and even earlier the Tea Party? And
with respect to this or generally?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer the second question first. You know, I've been a critic of the New York Times for my whole career on many issues and for many reasons, some of which Lissa alluded to, I think, in The Hunting of the President. A lot of that is about the bad coverage in the New York Times. And I think some of that continues to this day. One of the worst things that happened in the 2016 election was that the New York Times published a story about a false story about the Clinton Foundation on the front page that was planted there by none other than Steve Bannon, and it really harmed Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Clintons in general over a obviously false story. And meanwhile, they're not investigating the Trump Foundation, which is a complete fraud in their own backyard, okay? So why is that? I can't explain it, but I think it was emblematic of a very bad job that they've done over the years in covering this, not just Trump, but many of these forces on the right. So the reason that it's on the right and not on as much on the left, although there are examples on the left, and I talk about that in the introduction to the book, but a few, but much less. And I can only speculate. I mean, I can't go inside people's heads, but I think some of it is that an ideology that valorizes profit above anything else, which I'm not saying conservatism is, but a perverse version of conservatism is that, is going to make people vulnerable to this and make it okay to do this. Whereas liberals in the left, they actually are perhaps too hostile to the profit motive and to, you know, business, but that does afford them some level of protection. And you know, as I say in the book, there's a reason why the Republican Party's fundraising platform, WinRed, is a for-profit business. The Democratic one, Act Blue, is a nonprofit. It doesn't take anything except, you know, the credit card fees. So that's the best explanation I can give. I mean, the other part of it is that I do think if you are sort of science-based and reality-based and interested in facts, you have some level of immunity from conspiracy theories and the types of paranoia that play such a big role in this grifting.
thanks.
Anybody else? No?
Hi, thank you. How are you? Good. I just have a quick statement of agreement with you because I'm also a native New Yorker. Came down here about 20 years ago, and like you, I just couldn't believe that Trump was unknown to so many people across the country. Because if you're a New Yorker, no one.
You've been there.
Everyone knew
Yes.
it. Okay, so
Yes.
I'm in completely agreement with you on that issue.
Appreciate that.
And to George, I have a question. I don't know if this is a complete forum, but I'm sure everyone would like to know with the dynamic differences in opinions with you and your wife. I've been married for 34 years.
Ex-wife.
Ex-wife. Oh, okay. How did you guys have that difference of opinion and stay together that long? Okay. I'm sure, am I the only one that has that?
I didn't tell George this was going to happen when he agreed to come.
It happens from time to time wherever I go. But look, if you actually go issue by issue, we don't actually disagree on a huge amount. But if, on the question of this one man's character and the danger he presents to the Republic and the destructive force that he represents within his own party, because I think, if he loses this election for the Republicans, there's going to be no Republican Party left.
I agree.
Well, we need two parties, okay? We need two parties. We'll have to figure out what the next one's going to be. But, that's the point of the disagreement. And to me, it became a moral issue because, this man, for reasons that, go to psychopath.org, you can talk about it. He's an unwell man. And basically my view of what republicanism and conservatism, Trumpism has been over the last is basically just a giant lie about that. That he is any way competent and honorable and in any way takes the best interest of the country and the Constitution at heart. He doesn't. And that to me is that's just the no-brainer right there. And that's the sine qua non. I want to vote for somebody who actually believes in the country, even if I disagree with what they think should be enacted into law or how they should,
Well, I apologize. I didn't know that.
No, that's
I didn't know
okay.
it was that anything.
I'm sure that's all right. Listen. So we've had a joke, which is that we're looking forward to the day when
we can fight again.
We can
go
go
start
back
arguing.
to arguing and fighting
Joe.
about everything because we're
Silly
back in a
liberal
normal country.
nonsense.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Yeah, we want to go back to that.
And still be friends, and that's the
right.
thing.
The truth is, on things that truly matter, if you look at the entire breadth of human experience, it's like the differences between any of us in this room aren't that great.
No, they can be figured out.
They can be figured out.
And that's the country that we're fighting for. I'll say. If you're going to
click that donation box and you can get
that's right. If
you can make a monthly donation.
If you're going to have that fight, you like somebody like this with you. I'll tell you right now.
So we got time for one more question, and I guess you're the man.
Thank you, and thank you for hosting these things, and thank you for being here tonight. Let me get my phone open.
Are you phoning a friend?
My phone got me. No, it has my question So, what is the definition of conservatism, and how has that definition changed due to the grifting that you've referenced here, Joe?
I guess, there have been a lot of different definitions of conservatism over the years, and there's, the sort of religious right form of conservatism, which is very different from the libertarian version of conservatism, which is, again, different from the sort of, Chamber of Commerce type conservatism. So there have been a lot of different versions of conservatism in our country. But what now masquerades as conservatism is a dishonest business. It's not a philosophy. It has no consistency or coherence. They did away with the Republican platform the last time because they had, for precisely that reason. They have thrown over many of the shibboleths and ideas that they once held most dear, like no tariffs. Now they want tariffs. If you read the platform, so-called platform, that in all caps that they did, embarrassingly, there's not much to it. It's a bunch of grievances. It's not a philosophy anymore. So, you know, what always...
Grievances are good for raising money.
They are indeed. Thank you. And I mean, I have an idea of what George would tell you his conservatism is, which is limited government and not too much interference with business and, you know, protection of individual rights against the encroachment of government and other institutions. And a lot, you know, a lot of that I would agree with, as he said. Some of it I wouldn't. Some of it I think goes too far and in the other direction. But he's right when he says that we need the counterbalance in our political culture. It's very easy to go off track, to go off the rails if there are no guardrails, and the parties, at their best, provide the guardrails for each other. And, you know, as a Democrat, I'm going to say every time, you know, we need to do more to care for the people who can't care for themselves. And the conservatives might say, well, you can't do too much for this reason or that reason, and they might be right about some of it. But that's an argument that we can have and reach conclusions that are based on a democratic consensus, small d. And I believe conservatives could sign on to that, real conservatives, because they always did.
Yeah, I mean, what we have now is nihilism for profit.
That's the thing. It's not good for anyone, so.
Thank you all. This was
Yes, thank you so
great
much.
to have Joe here, and so great to have an attentive audience. And buy some books.
Buy more books.